Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change your entire life. Sometimes helping a stranger can lead you down a path you never saw coming. In the harsh Wyoming Territory, aging cowboy Finn Riverside was just trying to survive another scorching day when he found a wounded young man collapsed in the desert. With only drops of water left in his canteen, Finn had a choice to make. He could keep riding and save himself, or he could help a dying stranger. Without thinking twice, Finn gave the man his last bit of water. He thought that was the end of it. But the next morning, an entire native tribe arrived at his camp. They weren't there to fight. They came to honor an ancient tradition. What kind of man risks everything for someone he's never met? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly before Finn Riverside as he sat on his weathered porch, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. At 53, his hands bore the calluses and scars of 3 decades working this unforgiving land, and his face carried the deep lines that came from squinting against prairie winds and desert sun. The ranch he called home wasn't much to look at. A modest cabin with a tin roof that sang in the wind, a barn that leaned slightly to the east, and corrals that needed mending more often than he could afford, but it was his. Every struggling acre of it. The morning ritual began before dawn, as it had for 27 years. Finn would wake to the sound of his old rooster Gideon, announcing the day with more enthusiasm than the circumstances warranted. He'd pull on his boots, the same pair Margaret had bought him for his birthday in 1868, and step into air so crisp it made his breath visible even in summer. The first stop was always the well, where he'd draw water for the animals and fill his canteen. Water was precious here, more valuable than silver or gold, and every drop had to be rationed carefully. His horse Jasper would whinny softly from the corral, ears pricked forward in greeting. The old bay gelding had been with Finn for 15 years, since Margaret was still alive to fuss over both of them. She used to bring Jasper apples from their small orchard, back when the trees still bore fruit. Back when hope felt like something more than stubborn habit, Margaret. Even now, 5 years after losing her to the fever, Finn could hear her gentle voice calling from the cabin, telling him breakfast was ready, asking him to be careful, checking the fence line. She'd wanted children so badly it had become a physical ache between them. 3 times she'd carried a baby, and 3 times their hopes had been buried in the small cemetery on the hill behind the cabin. After the 3rd loss, something had shifted in Margaret's eyes. Not bitterness exactly, but a quiet acceptance that some dreams weren't meant to be. "We've got each other," she used to say, placing her hand over his during the long evenings when the silence felt too heavy. That's more than many folks have. Now, even that was gone. Finn kept her things exactly as she'd left them, her hairbrush on the dresser, her apron hanging by the kitchen door, her worn leather Bible on the nightstand beside what had been her side of the bed. He'd read from it sometimes, not because he was particularly religious, but because her handwriting filled the margins, little notes and prayers that made him feel less alone. The ranch itself reflected their shared struggles. Finn raised cattle, but drought years had taken their toll. The herd that once numbered nearly 200 head had dwindled to maybe 60, and half of those were too old or weak to bring much at market. The fence line needed constant repair, wire snapped in winter cold, posts rotted in spring floods, and replacing either cost money Finn didn't have. His nearest neighbor, Harvey Patterson, owned a spread twice the size 3 miles to the east. Patterson had inherited his land from his father, along with the money to stock it properly and weather the bad years. He was the kind of man who'd never missed a meal or worried about the cost of salt, and he made sure everyone knew it. Still, Patterson wasn't entirely bad. He'd helped Finn repair the barn roof after the storm last spring, and his wife, Cora, sometimes brought by preserves or fresh bread. The town of Cedar Falls lay 12 miles south, a collection of wooden buildings that served the scattered ranches and occasional travelers. There was Miller's General Store, where Finn bought supplies on credit when his pride allowed it. The Cattleman's Saloon, where he rarely went anymore because drinking alone felt too much like giving up. And the First Bank of Cedar Falls, where Harrison Wells held the mortgage on Finn's ranch like a sword over his head. Wells was a man who'd arrived from back east with clean hands and ambitious plans. He owned half the businesses in town and held loans on most of the ranches. He spoke with the measured cadence of education and wore suits even in the heat of summer. Finn had borrowed against the ranch twice, once during the drought of '79 and again when Margaret got sick and needed medicine from Denver. Both times Wells had been polite but firm about the terms. The payments were due quarterly, and Wells had a memory like a steel trap for dates and figures. The Indian tribes were another consideration entirely. The Shoshone and Arapaho moved through this territory as they had for generations, though their numbers had dwindled since the army began pushing them toward reservations. Most encounters were peaceful, trading horses or hides, sometimes sharing information about water sources or weather patterns. Finn had learned enough of their languages to manage basic communication, and he'd found them to be honorable people, more honest in their dealings than some of the white merchants in town. But tensions existed. Some of the newer settlers, particularly those who'd lost family in conflicts back east, viewed any Indian as a threat. Patterson fell into this category, though he'd never actually had trouble with any of the local tribes. Fear and prejudice ran deeper than experience in some men's hearts. On this particular morning in late July, the heat was building early. The sun hadn't yet climbed above the eastern ridge, but already the air shimmered with the promise of another scorching day. Finn had planned to ride out to the south pasture to check on a section of fence he'd spotted yesterday, and to count the cattle that grazed near Willow Creek, or what was left of it after 3 weeks without rain. As he saddled Jasper, the horse turned his head to look at him with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand more than an animal should. "I know, old friend," Finn murmured, adjusting the stirrups. "It's going to be another hot one. But the work won't do itself." He filled his canteen from the well, checking the level twice. The water table had dropped noticeably over the summer, and he'd started rationing more carefully. Margaret used to tease him about his precise habits, the way he'd measure coffee beans, count fence posts, track every penny spent. "You're methodical as a preacher counting sins," she'd say with a smile that took any sting from the words. The leather saddlebags held the tools he might need: wire cutters, a hammer, extra staples for repairs, and a small pouch of dried beef for lunch. Finn had learned long ago that preparation prevented most emergencies, though the territory had ways of surprising even the most careful man. As they rode away from the ranch, Jasper's hooves raised small clouds of dust that hung in the still air. The landscape around them told the story of a hard summer. Grass brown and brittle, creek beds reduced to scattered pools, and the mountains in the distance wavering behind heat mirages. But there was beauty here too, if a man knew how to see it. The way morning light caught the faces of red sandstone cliffs, the delicate purple flowers that somehow bloomed despite the drought. The endless sky that made him feel both insignificant and part of something magnificent. This was the land that had claimed Margaret's heart first, before she'd claimed his. She'd arrived with her father, a circuit preacher who died of a heart attack 6 months after they'd settled. At 19, Margaret could have returned east to family, but she'd chosen to stay. "There's something about this place," she'd told Finn during their courtship. "It tests you, but it doesn't lie to you. You always know where you stand." Now, as Finn guided Jasper along the familiar trail toward the south pasture, he carried the weight of all those memories and the uncertainty of all his tomorrows. The ranch needed improvements he couldn't afford. The bank wanted payments he struggled to make, and every day felt like a careful balance between hope and resignation. He had no way of knowing that by sunset, everything he thought he knew about his future would change forever. The heat struck Finn like a physical blow as he and Jasper made their way toward the dried creek bed. By mid-morning, The sun had climbed high enough to turn the air into something thick and oppressive, and sweat already stained his shirt despite the early hour. He'd been riding for 2 hours, checking fence posts and counting cattle, when he spotted something that made him pull up short. There, beside what had once been Willow Creek, but was now little more than a series of stagnant pools, lay a human form motionless in the meager shade of a stunted cottonwood. Finn's first instinct was caution. In this territory, you approached unknown situations carefully, especially when they involved people you didn't recognize. But as Jasper picked his way closer, stepping delicately around the scattered rocks and dried brush, Finn could see this wasn't a threat. It was a young man, probably no more than 20, and he was in serious trouble. The stranger wore the simple leather clothing of the local tribes, though Finn couldn't immediately tell which one. His long black hair was matted with sweat and dust, and his skin had the greyish pallor that spoke of severe dehydration. A crude bandage wrapped around his left thigh showed dark stains where blood had seeped through, and his breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. Finn dismounted and approached on foot, making enough noise to announce his presence in case the young man was conscious. "Easy there, son," he said softly. "I'm here to help." The stranger's eyes fluttered open, dark brown, glazed with fever, but still alert enough to register fear. He tried to sit up, then fell back with a soft groan. His lips were cracked and bleeding, and when he tried to speak, only a harsh whisper emerged. "Water," the young man managed in accented English. "Please." Finn looked down at his canteen, feeling its weight against his hip. He'd filled it that morning, but the day was young, and he still had hours of work ahead of him. The return trip to the ranch would take at least 2 hours in this heat, and he'd planned to check 2 more sections of fence before heading home. Logic dictated that he conserve what he had, one man's careful rationing versus another man's immediate crisis. But some decisions don't come from logic. Without hesitation, Finn uncapped his canteen and knelt beside the wounded stranger. "Slow sips," he instructed, supporting the young man's head. "Too much too fast will make you sick." The stranger drank with desperate gratitude, and Finn found himself pouring more water than prudence suggested. He watched the man's color improve slightly, saw some life return to those dark eyes, and felt a familiar satisfaction, the same feeling he'd gotten when nursing sick cattle back to health or coaxing crops from reluctant soil. "Thank you," the young man whispered. His English was careful but clear. "I'm Dakota, Finn Riverside," Finn replied. "What happened to you, son?" Dakota gestured weakly toward his wounded leg. "Horse fell," he said. "Broke leg. I walked long time. No water." Finn examined the makeshift bandage and whistled softly. The wound was deep, but had stopped bleeding, and it showed signs of basic field treatment. "You did good work patching this up. How long have you been walking?" 2 days, maybe 3. Dakota's voice was stronger now, though still hoarse. "Lost time, lost direction. 2 or 3 days without water in this heat should have killed him." The fact that Dakota was still alive spoke to both his toughness and sheer luck. Finn looked around at the barren landscape, then back at his nearly empty canteen. He'd given the young man almost half his water, and the sun wasn't even at its peak yet. "Can you travel?" Finn asked. Dakota struggled to sit up, then shook his head. "Leg won't hold me." "Too weak." Finn considered his options. He could ride back to the ranch for help, but that would mean leaving Dakota alone for at least 4 hours, and the young man might not survive that long in the direct sun. He could try to get Dakota onto Jasper, but the horse was already carrying a full load, and the injured man might not have the strength to stay mounted. That left the third option, the one Margaret would have insisted on. Without a moment's hesitation, "All right," Finn said, making his decision. "We'll make camp here until you're stronger. There's still some shade, and I can get water from those pools." He spent the next hour creating a proper shelter, using his rope to stretch his slicker between the cottonwood and a fallen log, providing more shade for the wounded man. The water in the nearest pool was brackish and warm, but he filtered it through his neckerchief and found it drinkable. Not good, but it would keep them alive. Dakota watched these preparations with growing amazement. "You stay?" he asked. "For stranger. I wouldn't leave a dog to die in this heat," Finn replied, though he knew it was more than that. There was something about the young man's dignity in the face of suffering, his quiet gratitude, that reminded Finn of the better angels Margaret had always seen in people. As the afternoon wore on, they shared the filtered water and talked in the careful English that marked Dakota as educated beyond what most white settlers expected. He spoke of his people, the northern Arapaho, and their summer camp 2 days' ride to the north. He'd been hunting alone when his horse had stepped wrong and broken its leg in a prairie dog hole. "I put horse out of pain," Dakota said simply. "Then I walked." The matter-of-fact way he spoke of this necessary cruelty told Finn volumes about the young man's character. There was no self-pity, no anger at his circumstances, only the practical acceptance of someone who understood that survival sometimes demanded hard choices. As evening approached, Finn managed to coax a small fire from gathered twigs and dried grass. The smoke would signal their location to anyone who might be searching, though he wasn't sure if that was good or bad. He shared his dried beef with Dakota, watched the young man's strength return gradually, and found himself thinking about the strange turns life could take. This morning, he'd been a solitary rancher with predictable problems, drought, debt, and the daily grind of maintaining a struggling operation. Now he was nursing a wounded stranger in the middle of nowhere, gambling his own safety on the character of someone he'd just met. Margaret would have done the same thing without question. She'd nursed injured animals, helped sick neighbors, and once spent 3 days caring for a family of travelers whose children had taken fever. "We're all just walking each other home," she used to say. "Might as well make the journey easier when we can." As darkness fell and the desert air began to cool, Dakota reached into a small pouch he wore around his neck. He withdrew something that caught the firelight, a perfectly shaped arrowhead made from black obsidian, polished smooth and sharp enough to shave with. "My grandfather made this," he said, holding it out to Finn. "Sacred stone, sacred purpose. You take it." "Token of life debt," Finn hesitated. He knew enough about tribal customs to understand that this wasn't a casual gift. "I can't take something that important to you." "Is important," Dakota agreed. "That's why you must take. Life given, life owed. This is our way." Finn accepted the arrowhead, feeling its surprising weight in his palm. The obsidian was cool and smooth, and he could see layers of skill in its creation, not just a tool, but art. "What does it mean?" he asked. "This life debt?" Dakota smiled for the first time since Finn had found him. "Means story not finished yet, Finn Riverside. Means you set something in motion that will return to you threefold." They slept in shifts that night, taking turns feeding the fire and watching for predators. When dawn broke clear and cool, Dakota was strong enough to stand with help, and his fever had broken completely. "I go home now," he said. "Family will worry." Finn helped him to his feet and steadied him until he found his balance. The young man was still weak, but determination had returned to his bearing. "You sure you can make it?" Finn asked. Dakota nodded. 2 days, easy walking. I follow creek bed north, fine trail." He paused, then gripped Finn's shoulder with surprising strength. "You saved more than life, friend. You saved honor. That means everything to my people." They parted ways as the sun climbed above the eastern ridge. Finn watched until Dakota disappeared among the rocks and brush, then began his own journey home. The obsidian arrowhead rode in his shirt pocket, warm against his chest, a reminder of the strange encounter that had changed a routine day into something meaningful. He had no idea that in the young man's village, preparations were already beginning for a ceremony that would change his life forever. The ride back to the ranch gave Finn too much time to think. As Jasper picked his way carefully across the broken ground, Finn found himself touching the obsidian arrowhead in his pocket, wondering what exactly he'd gotten himself into. The weight of it seemed heavier than stone should be, as if it carried the gravity of obligations he didn't fully understand. By the time he reached home, the sun was past its peak and the heat had become truly punishing. The first thing he noticed was the broken gate on the main corral. One of his few remaining steers had pushed through the weakened boards and was now grazing contentedly in Margaret's old vegetable garden, trampling what remained of her carefully tended herbs. "Damnation," Finn muttered, swinging down from the saddle. His legs ached from the long ride, and his shirt was soaked through with sweat. The water he'd given to Dakota was water he couldn't spare, and now dehydration was making every task feel twice as difficult. It took him the better part of an hour to coax the steer back into the corral and patch the gate with scrap wood. The repair was temporary at best. The posts were rotting and the whole section needed rebuilding, but it would hold for now. Everything on the ranch felt temporary these days, a constant series of patches and postponements. As he worked, Finn's mind kept drifting to the wounded young man. Had Dakota made it safely back to his people? Was he even now telling the story of the white rancher who'd shared his water? The idea made Finn uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite name. He'd done what any decent person would do, nothing more. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his thoughts. Finn looked up to see a familiar figure riding hard toward the ranch. Harrison Wells, the banker, his usually pristine suit dusty from travel. Wells rarely made house calls unless the news was particularly bad, and the grim set of his face suggested this visit wouldn't be pleasant. "Riverside," Wells called as he reined in his horse. "Need to have a word with you." Finn set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his pants. "Mr. Wells, what brings you all the way out here?" Wells dismounted with the careful movements of a man unaccustomed to long rides. He was perhaps 40, soft around the middle, with thinning hair and the pale complexion of someone who spent his days indoors. "Your payment was due yesterday," he said without preamble. $57.40. Finn felt his stomach drop. In all the concern over Dakota, he'd completely forgotten about the quarterly payment. "I thought it was due next week. Check your calendar, Riverside." July 28th. "That was yesterday." Wells pulled a leather folder from his saddlebag and extracted a sheet of paper. "According to the terms of your loan, any payment more than 24 hours late incurs a penalty of 10%. 10%. Finn stared at the banker. "That wasn't in the original agreement." "Read the fine print." "Section 12, subsection 4? Wells held out the paper. "The new total is $63.14, due within 7 days. Finn took the document, though he knew what it would say. Wells was meticulous about such things, and his contracts were ironclad. "I don't have $63. "Then I suggest you find it quickly." Wells folded his hands behind his back and surveyed the ranch with obvious distaste. "This property would fetch perhaps $300 at auction, maybe $400 if we're lucky. Enough to cover your outstanding debt and leave you something to start over somewhere else. This land has been my home for 27 years, and I'm sure it holds sentimental value. But sentiment doesn't pay bills." Wells climbed back onto his horse with some difficulty. 7 days, Riverside. After that, I'll have no choice but to begin foreclosure proceedings." Finn watched the banker ride away, dust trailing behind him like a physical manifestation of the trouble he'd brought. $63 might as well have been 63,000. He had maybe $12 in the coffee tin where he kept his savings, and his cattle weren't ready for market. Even if they were, beef prices had fallen so low that selling his entire herd wouldn't cover the debt. He sank onto the porch steps, suddenly feeling every one of his 53 years. The obsidian arrowhead seemed to burn against his chest, a reminder of the choice he'd made. Had helping Dakota been worth losing his ranch? The question felt like a betrayal of everything Margaret had taught him about right and wrong, but it lodged in his mind nonetheless. Meanwhile, 60 miles to the north, the northern Arapaho summer camp bustled with activity as Dakota limped into the circle of lodges. His arrival caused immediate excitement. He'd been missing for 4 days, and search parties had found only his dead horse and tracks leading south into the white man's territory. His father, a respected hunter named Grey Wolf, embraced him carefully, mindful of his injuries. "We feared the worst, my son." "I would have died," Dakota said simply, "but a white rancher found me. shared his water, stayed with me through the night, asked nothing in return. Word spread quickly through the camp, and soon Takoda found himself surrounded by elders, all listening intently as he described his rescue. He showed them the black powder burns on his leg from where he'd cauterized the wound, explained how the white man had built shelter and shared his food. "What was this man's name?" asked Chief Broken Arrow, Takoda's uncle and leader of their band, Finn Riverside. "He has kind eyes and gentle hands. He spoke to me as an equal, not as his people usually speak to ours." Chief Broken Arrow was a man of perhaps 55, his face marked by years of careful decision-making and the weight of leadership. He wore his graying hair in traditional braids, and his buckskin shirt bore the intricate beadwork that marked his status. Around his neck hung an eagle feather headdress passed down through 5 generations of chiefs. "You gave him the arrowhead?" the chief asked. "Yes, uncle, grandfather's arrowhead." He understood its importance. The chief nodded slowly. Among their people, the giving of such a gift created obligations that transcended the immediate moment. A life debt was not a simple matter of gratitude. It was a sacred bond that demanded proper acknowledgement. "We must speak with the council," Chief Broken Arrow decided. "This man's kindness cannot go unhonored." That evening, as the sun set over the mountains and cook fires began to dot the camp, the tribal council gathered in the chief's lodge. 7 elders sat in a circle, their weathered faces serious in the flickering light. Takoda told his story again, providing every detail he could remember about his rescue. "The old ways are clear," said Running Bear, the eldest of the council. "Life given for life. When a man saves one of our people without thought for himself, he becomes family." "The white man's world is different from ours," cautioned another elder. "Their customs may not welcome our traditions." Chief Broken Arrow held up his hand for silence. "Our ways are sacred, given to us by the Great Spirit. They do not change because others do not understand them. This Finn Riverside saved my nephew's life. Honor demands a response. What response do you propose?" asked Running Bear. The chief was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of ancient tradition. "We will offer him the greatest gift our people can give. We will offer him family." At the center of the circle, a young woman sat quietly in the shadows, listening to every word. Ayana was the chief's daughter, 24 years old, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance. She was known throughout the camp for her intelligence, her skill with horses, and her gentle way with children. She had refused 3 marriage proposals from worthy men, always saying she was waiting for a sign from the spirits. As her father spoke of offering family to the white stranger, Ayana felt something stir in her chest, not fear exactly, but recognition. Perhaps this was the sign she'd been waiting for. The eagle feather headdress seemed to glow in the firelight as Chief Broken Arrow made his decision. Tomorrow they would begin preparations for a journey south, carrying with them the most sacred traditions of their people and the weight of honor that could not be denied. The preparations in the Arapaho camp began before dawn. Ayana woke to the sound of women singing the ancient songs that accompanied sacred work, their voices carrying across the still morning air like prayers made audible. She lay in her lodge for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of her world, children laughing, horses nickering, the soft conversations of her people beginning another day. Today would be different. Today would change everything. She rose and began her morning rituals with special care, braiding her long black hair with the silver ornaments her grandmother had given her, choosing her finest dress of soft doeskin decorated with intricate beadwork. Each bead had been placed with intention, telling the story of her family's honor, their connection to the earth and sky. Her mother had died when Ayana was 12, leaving behind only memories and the wedding blanket she had woven with her own hands. It was a masterpiece of their people's art, buffalo hide made supple as silk, painted with symbols of unity and protection, fringed with shells that had traveled from distant oceans. For 12 years, that blanket had waited in Ayana's lodge, untouched except for the reverent care she gave it during the changing seasons. Now, as she lifted it from its sacred place, she wondered about the man who would share it with her. Her father had described him as kind, a man who would sacrifice his own welfare for a stranger. But what kind of life awaited her in the white man's world? Would he accept the traditions that were as much a part of her as breathing? "You are troubled, daughter," Chief Broken Arrow observed, entering her lodge with the careful respect he always showed, even for family. "Not troubled, father, thoughtful." Ayana folded the wedding blanket with practiced movements. "This Finn Riverside, tell me again what Dakota said about him." The chief settled beside her, his weathered hands gentle as he helped her pack. "He spoke of a man who asked no questions, expected no payment, shared his last water without hesitation." Dakota said his eyes held sadness, but also strength. "He has lost someone," Ayana said. It wasn't a question. She had learned to read the signs of grief in others, having carried her own for so many years. Perhaps. "The white settlers often lose family to this harsh land." Her father paused in his packing. "Are you certain about this path, my daughter? The council would understand if you chose differently." Ayana considered the question she had been asking herself since the decision was made. She could refuse this honor, allow it to pass to another family, continue her quiet life among her people. But something in Dakota's story had stirred a feeling she couldn't ignore, a sense that this was meant to be, that the Great Spirit had been preparing her for this moment all her life. "I am certain," she said. "If he is truly the man Dakota described, then this is no sacrifice. It is a gift from both our worlds." While Ayana prepared for the journey that would change her life, Finn was discovering just how desperate his situation had become. The morning after Wells's visit, he'd ridden into Cedar Falls to explore what few options remained to him. And each conversation had closed another door. Muller's general store was busy with the usual mix of ranchers, townspeople and travelers, but Finn noticed how conversations quieted when he entered. News traveled fast in a small community, and everyone knew about his troubles with the bank. "Morning, Finn," Hans Muller called from behind the counter. The shopkeeper was a decent man, German-born but American by choice, who'd always dealt fairly with his customers. "What can I do for you?" "Need to know what my credit looks like, Hans. Straight talk." Muller's expression grew uncomfortable. "Wells was in here yesterday, Finn. Made it clear he doesn't want me extending any more credit to folks who might not be able to pay." "I see." Finn kept his voice level, though the news hit like a physical blow. "What do I owe you now?" $18.60. "I'm not worried about it, mind you. I know you're good for it. But Wells holds the note on my building too, if you catch my meaning." Finn understood perfectly. Wells was squeezing from all directions, making sure Finn had no alternatives to selling the ranch. "I'll get you that money, Hans, somehow." His next stop was the cattleman's saloon, where he found Harvey Patterson holding court at a corner table with several other ranchers. Patterson was a big man with a voice to match, the kind who never met a story he couldn't improve with the telling. "Finn Riverside." Patterson boomed. "Come join us. We were just discussing the Indian situation." Finn approached cautiously. Patterson's discussions about Indians rarely ended well. "What situation?" "Scouts reported a large party moving south from the reservation. Armed warriors, fancy dress, the whole show." Patterson leaned forward conspiratorially. "Word is they're looking for someone. Could be trouble brewing, or it could be a peaceful gathering," Finn suggested. "Most of my dealings with the local tribes have been straightforward." "That's because you're too trusting. Your friend..." Patterson's voice carried the certainty of a man who'd never had his assumptions challenged. "Indians are Indians. Give them an inch, they'll take everything you've got. Have you actually had trouble with any of them?" "Don't need to put my hand in a fire to know it burns." Patterson drained his beer and signaled for another. "Mark my words, when trouble comes, it'll be because someone was too soft, too willing to accommodate their heathen ways." Finn left the saloon feeling more isolated than when he'd arrived. Patterson's prejudices were widely shared among the newer settlers, men who'd brought their fears and hatreds from conflicts back east. The established ranchers tended to be more practical in their dealings with the tribes, but they were outnumbered now by newcomers who saw every Indian as a threat. The final blow came at the bank itself, where Finn had hoped to negotiate some kind of extension or modified payment plan. Wells received him in his office, a room designed to intimidate with its heavy furniture and formal portraits of stern-faced men in Eastern clothing. "I'm afraid there's nothing to discuss, Riverside. The terms of your loan are quite clear, and you've already received more consideration than most borrowers would expect." "I'm asking for 1 month," Finn said. 30 days to find the money, and I'm telling you that 30 days won't change your circumstances. You have no collateral left, no income sufficient to service your debt, and no prospects for improvement. Wells opened a file on his desk. "I've been patient because of your late wife's reputation in this community, but charity has its limits. This isn't charity, it's business, exactly. And good business sometimes requires difficult decisions." Wells closed the file with finality. 5 days, Riverside. After that I begin foreclosure proceedings. The ride home gave Finn time to face the inevitable. He would lose the ranch, lose the life he'd built with Margaret, lose the only home he'd known as an adult man. The obsidian arrowhead in his pocket seemed to mock him, a token of honor from a stranger. Received on the same day, he'd sealed his own financial doom. As he crested the hill that gave him his first view of the ranch, Finn made a decision that surprised him. He wouldn't run from this. He'd face whatever came with the same dignity Margaret would have expected, the same honor that had compelled him to help a wounded stranger in the desert. Behind him, invisible in the afternoon heat haze, a party of Arapaho riders began their journey south, carrying with them traditions older than memory, and a wedding blanket that had waited 12 years for its moment. The Arapaho delegation moved across the Wyoming landscape like a prayer made visible. 20 riders in ceremonial dress, their horses decorated with feathers and painted symbols. They traveled not as warriors, but as bearers of sacred tradition. Chief Broken Arrow led them, the eagle feather headdress catching the morning light as he guided his painted stallion along ancient trails his grandfather had shown him decades ago. Ayana rode near the center of the group, her wedding blanket carefully wrapped in waterproof buffalo hide and secured to her horse's saddle. She had never traveled this far into White Territory, and everything about the landscape spoke of different ways of seeing the world. Where her people saw the natural flow of water and wind, white settlers had imposed straight lines, fences that divided the earth into rigid squares, roads that cut across the land regardless of terrain. The ceremonial peace pipe rode in a place of honor, carried by Running Bear, the eldest of their party. Carved from red stone and decorated with symbols of unity, it had been used in treaties and sacred ceremonies for 3 generations. Today it would serve as both gift and symbol, a bridge between worlds that had too often met in conflict. "Tell me about the white man's customs," Ayana asked Grey Wolf, Dakota's father, who rode beside her. He had traded with settlers for many years and understood their ways better than most. "They are a puzzling people," Grey Wolf replied thoughtfully. "They value individual ownership above community sharing, yet they gather in towns and churches like pack animals seeking safety. They fear the spirits that live in natural places, yet they hunger for the very land that frightens them. And their marriages? How do they choose partners? Usually the man asks the woman's father for permission, though I'm told some choose for themselves now. They speak vows before their chief priest and exchange metal rings as symbols." Grey Wolf smiled gently. "But love grows the same way in any soil, daughter. That much I have learned." As they traveled, Siana found herself thinking about the man she would soon meet. Dakota had described him as weathered and kind, a man who worked with his hands and spoke softly. He had lost his wife. That much was clear from the sadness Dakota had seen in his eyes. Perhaps they would understand each other's grief, find comfort in shared experience. The delegation made camp at midday beside a clear stream, the horses grateful for water and rest. As the women prepared a simple meal, the men discussed the ceremony that would take place once they reached Finn's ranch. The traditions were ancient and precise, handed down through generations of chiefs and elders. The approach must be peaceful, Chief Broken Arrow instructed. No weapons visible, no sudden movements. We come as family, not as strangers. And if he refuses? Asked one of the younger warriors. Then we honor his choice and depart with dignity. But I do not think he will refuse. A man who saves a life without thought for reward understands honor, even if he does not know our ways. Meanwhile, Finn was discovering that solitude could be both blessing and curse. The work of maintaining the ranch continued despite his troubles. Cattle still needed tending, fences still required repair, and the daily routines that had sustained him through Margaret's death now provided anchor against this new storm. But the silence of the house pressed down on him like a physical weight. In the evenings, when the day's work was done and darkness settled over the prairie, Finn found himself talking to Margaret as if she were still there, sitting in her chair by the fireplace, mending clothes or reading from her Bible. "I don't know what to do. Margaret," he said aloud, his voice echoing strangely in the empty cabin. "Lost the payment date, lost my credit, probably going to lose everything we built together." The silence that answered felt different tonight, expectant somehow, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Finn pulled Margaret's Bible from the nightstand and opened it to a page marked with her ribbon bookmark. Her handwriting filled the margins, her notes and reflections accumulated over years of study. "Cast your bread upon the waters," he read aloud. "You will find it after many days." You always believed that, didn't you? That kindness comes back somehow. A sound outside made him look up, not threatening but unusual for this time of evening. Jasper was nickering softly, the sound horses make when greeting familiar friends. Finn set down the Bible and moved to the window, peering into the darkness beyond the porch light. Nothing visible, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Not malevolent, but present. He considered stepping outside to investigate, then decided against it. Whatever was out there would reveal itself in its own time. The feeling stayed with him through a restless night. And when dawn came, Finn found himself rising earlier than usual, drawn to the porch by an anticipation he couldn't name. The morning was clear and still, with the kind of crystalline air that made distant mountains appear close enough to touch. He was checking the water level in the trough when Jasper suddenly raised his head, ears pricked forward, looking toward the eastern trail. A moment later, Finn heard it too, the soft thunder of many horses moving at a steady pace, still distant but approaching. His first thought was Patterson and his friends, coming to warn him about Indian trouble or perhaps to offer unwanted advice about his financial problems. But as the sound grew closer, Finn realized this was something different. The rhythm was too measured, too ceremonial for a casual visit. He walked to the front of the house and shaded his eyes against the rising sun. There, cresting the ridge that marked the eastern boundary of his property, a line of riders appeared. Even at distance, their purpose was unmistakable. This was a formal delegation, moving with the dignity of ancient tradition. Finn's hand moved instinctively to the obsidian arrowhead in his pocket. Somehow, he knew this visit was connected to the wounded young man he'd helped. The life debt Dakota had spoken of was about to be explained. As the riders drew closer, Finn could see the intricate details of their ceremonial dress, feathered headdresses, painted horses, clothing decorated with beadwork that caught the morning light like scattered jewels. At their head rode a man of obvious authority, his bearing regal despite the simple buckskin of his clothing. They approached slowly, giving Finn time to process what he was seeing, time to understand that this was no threat, but something far more significant. When they were perhaps 50 yards away, the entire party halted as one, waiting for some signal Finn didn't understand. The leader raised his hand in a gesture that transcended language, palm forward, fingers spread, the universal sign of peaceful intent. When Finn raised his own hand in response, the delegation resumed their approach, stopping again when they reached the edge of his property. What happened next would change everything Finn thought he knew about his future, about honor, and about the mysterious ways that kindness could return to reshape a man's entire world. Chief Broken Arrow dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who had spent his life on horseback. He walked forward alone, stopping at a respectful distance from Finn's porch, and spoke in careful English. "I am Chief Broken Arrow of the Northern Arapaho. I seek the man called Finn Riverside." "That's me," Finn replied, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "You're welcome here, Chief." The formal words seemed to unlock something in the morning air. The chief smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered features, and gestured toward his party. "We come to honor a debt. My nephew Takoda lives because of your kindness." As if summoned by his name, a familiar figure emerged from among the riders. Takoda, looking healthier and stronger than when Finn had last seen him, slid down from his horse and approached with obvious joy. "Finn Riverside," he said, gripping Finn's hand in both of his. "You see? I told them you were a man of honor. I just did what anyone would do," Finn protested, but Takoda shook his head. "No, what anyone should do, perhaps, but what few actually do when the cost is high." Takoda's English was clearer now, more confident. "My uncle wishes to speak with you. Will you hear him?" Finn nodded, and Chief Broken Arrow stepped closer. From a beaded pouch at his side, he withdrew a carved pipe, red stone inlaid with silver, its stem decorated with eagle feathers and small shells. "This is the sacred pipe of my grandfather's grandfather," the chief explained. "When men of different tribes wished to speak truth to each other, they shared this pipe. The smoke carries words to the Great Spirit, and no man can lie while the sacred smoke rises." Finn accepted the pipe with hands that barely trembled. He had no idea of the proper protocol, but respect seemed universal. "I'm honored, Chief." They sat on the porch steps, and as Chief Broken Arrow lit the pipe with a small ember carried in a special pouch, he began to speak of traditions older than memory. "Among our people, when a man saves another's life without thought for reward or recognition, he becomes family. Not by blood, but by choice and honor. This bond cannot be broken by distance or time." The pipe smoke rose between them, sweet and clean in the morning air. Finn took a careful draw when it was offered, feeling the weight of ceremony in every gesture. "I understand the honor you're showing me," Finn said carefully, "but I'm not sure what's expected." "My daughter," the chief said simply. "Ayana, she has chosen to accept the role of binding our families together. If you are willing." The words hit Finn like a physical blow. He nearly dropped the pipe, catching it just in time. "Your daughter?" "She is 24 winters old, educated in both our ways and the white man's learning. She speaks your language well, understands the customs of your people." The chief's voice carried deep affection. "She is my greatest treasure, and I offer her freely because of what you did for Takoda." From among the riders, a young woman stepped forward. Even at distance, Finn could see her grace, the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. She wore traditional dress of soft leather, decorated with intricate beadwork, and her long black hair was adorned with silver ornaments that caught the light. "This was Ayana. I need to understand," Finn said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're offering me marriage to your daughter?" "I am offering you family," the chief corrected gently. "Ayana has chosen to accept this honor, but the choice must be yours as well. Among our people, marriage is not just between man and woman, but between families, between worlds. You saved one of our own. Now we invite you to become one of our own." Finn's mind reeled. 3 days ago, his biggest worry had been making a bank payment. Now he was being offered something he'd never imagined, by people whose customs he barely understood. "This is overwhelming," he admitted. "Of course it is. That is why we will camp nearby for 7 days, if you permit. Time for you to know us, for us to know you. Time for understanding to grow." The chief paused, studying Finn's face. "But first you should meet my daughter. Words are poor vessels for truth. Only the heart can judge the heart." Ayana approached with measured steps, her eyes downcast in the modest manner appropriate to formal introduction. When she was close enough for conversation, she raised her gaze to meet Finn's, and he felt something shift in his chest. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black, but they held depths that spoke of intelligence and kindness. There was no fear in them, no reluctance, only a quiet curiosity that mirrored his own. "Finn Riverside," she said, her English accented but clear. "I am Ayana, daughter of Broken Arrow, grateful for your kindness to my cousin." "Miss Ayana," Finn replied, rising and removing his hat. "The pleasure is mine." She smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed her face from merely pretty to truly beautiful. "My father says you have gentle hands and a generous heart. Dakota says you shared your last water without hesitation. These are good signs for a woman to hear about a man. I'm not sure I deserve such praise. Humility is also a good sign," she said with a hint of humor, "though too much of it can become tiresome." Despite his confusion and uncertainty, Finn found himself smiling. There was something about her directness, her lack of artificial coyness, that reminded him of Margaret's forthright nature. "I should warn you," he said, "I'm not much of a catch these days. The bank's about to foreclose on my ranch. I've got more debts than assets, and I'm old enough to be your father." "You are 15 years older than me," Ayana replied matter-of-factly. "My father was 12 years older than my mother, and theirs was a good marriage. As for your other troubles, problems can be solved by people working together." The chief stood, brushing dust from his leggings. "We will make camp by the creek with your permission. Tonight we feast together, share stories, begin to know each other. Tomorrow you can show us your land, your work. We have much to learn about each other's worlds." As the delegation began to establish their camp, Finn stood watching with a mixture of wonder and terror. In the space of an hour, his solitary existence had been transformed into something he couldn't have imagined. The sacred medicine pouch hanging from Ayana's belt seemed to catch the light as she worked, a reminder that he was stepping into a world where different laws applied, where honor and tradition carried weight beyond practical concerns. The obsidian arrowhead in his pocket had become warm against his chest, as if responding to the presence of its maker's people. Whatever happened in the days to come, Finn knew his life would never be the same. The first 2 days passed in a careful dance of discovery. Finn found himself spending hours by the Arapaho camp, learning names and customs, sharing meals cooked over open fires that tasted better than anything he'd prepared in his own kitchen. Ayana proved to be everything her father had claimed, intelligent, graceful, and possessed of a gentle humor that put him at ease despite the extraordinary circumstances. On the third morning, as Finn prepared for another day of getting to know his unexpected guests, a nagging feeling drew him back to the cabin. The weight of decision pressed down on him, and he found himself seeking the one source of wisdom that had never failed him, Margaret's memory. He pulled out the wooden box where he kept her most precious belongings, items too personal to display but too important to discard. Her wedding ring, a simple gold band worn thin by years of work and love. Letters from her sister back east, a pressed flower from their first spring together, and at the bottom, wrapped in faded blue silk, something he'd forgotten was there. His hands trembled as he unwrapped the small bundle. Inside were papers, official documents, certificates and letters, but more importantly, there was a photograph he'd never seen before. It showed a young woman who looked remarkably like Margaret, but dressed in the traditional clothing of the Plains tribes. The woman stood beside a white man in frontier dress, both of them smiling at the camera with obvious happiness. With growing amazement, Finn began to read the documents. Margaret's birth certificate, issued in Denver, listed her father as Thomas McKinney, Irish immigrant and tradesman. But her mother was listed as Morning Star McKinney née White Dove, Cheyenne Nation. Margaret had been half Native American. Finn sank into a chair, his mind reeling. In 27 years of marriage, Margaret had never mentioned this heritage. Not once had she spoken of her mother's people, their customs, their language. He thought of all the times she'd defended the local tribes when neighbors spoke harshly of them, her insistence that they were good people trying to survive in a changing world. He'd attributed her tolerance to her generous nature, never suspecting it came from personal understanding. More documents revealed the story. Margaret's mother had died when she was very young, and her father had moved them far from tribal lands, probably to escape prejudice. In the letters, scattered references suggested Margaret had lived in fear that her heritage would be discovered, that it would bring shame or danger to them both. One letter, written in Margaret's careful hand but never sent, was addressed to her sister. "Dearest Sarah, I have never told Thomas about Mother's people. The hatred toward Indians grows stronger each year, and I fear what knowledge of my blood might bring upon us. He is a good man, but would he still love me if he knew? Would the neighbors still trade with us? Would the bank still extend credit? I carry this secret like a stone in my heart, but I dare not set it down." Finn wiped tears from his eyes, overwhelmed by the revelation that Margaret had carried this burden alone. All those years, she'd hidden a fundamental part of herself out of fear that the man who loved her might reject her for something beyond her control. But the final document in the bundle changed everything. It was another letter, this one dated just months before Margaret's death. "My beloved Thomas, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have finally found what I was too frightened to share while I lived. My mother was White Dove of the Cheyenne, a woman of great wisdom and gentle spirit, who died too young. I have dishonored her memory by hiding my heritage, but I was afraid of losing you, afraid of losing our place in this world, but I am not afraid anymore. If the Great Spirit grants you another chance at love, do not let fear guide your choices as I did. Love is love, no matter what form it takes or what people think of it. Honor my mother's memory by being the good man I always knew you to be. The ring I wear was hers, passed down through generations of women who knew how to love across the boundaries others created. If another woman comes into your life who understands both worlds, perhaps she should wear it. With all my love." Margaret Finn stared at the ring that had never left Margaret's finger during their marriage, a simple gold band that he'd assumed came from her Irish father. Now he understood that it carried a deeper history, a connection to generations of women who had loved beyond the boundaries of race and culture. With shaking hands, he carried the box outside, where Chief Broken Arrow was teaching several children how to braid rope. The chief looked up as Finn approached, his weathered face showing immediate concern. "You are troubled, friend Finn." "I need to show you something," Finn said quietly. "Something that changes everything." He showed the chief the photograph first, watching as understanding dawned in the older man's eyes. Then came the documents, the letters, the story of Margaret's hidden heritage. Chief Broken Arrow examined each item with the reverence due to sacred objects, occasionally translating for the other elders who gathered around. "Your wife was Cheyenne," the chief said finally. "Sister people to ours. The spirits guided you to save Takoda. This was not chance." "She was afraid," Finn said, his voice heavy with grief for his wife's long-carried burden. "Afraid I wouldn't love her if I knew. Fear makes us small," observed Running Bear, the eldest of the group. "But love makes us large enough to hold any truth." Ayana, who had been working nearby, approached with quiet steps. "May I see the photograph?" Finn handed it to her, watching as she studied the image with careful attention. "She was beautiful," Ayana said softly. "You can see the strength in her face, the kindness. She would have been welcome among any of our people." "She hid this her whole life," Finn said. "Never told me, never spoke of her mother's people, because she loved you," Ayana replied simply. "She feared losing what she treasured most. But see, she left you the truth to find when you were ready for it." Chief Broken Arrow stood and placed a hand on Finn's shoulder. "This changes the meaning of our offer, but not the offer itself. You are not just a kind stranger, you are family twice over. Your wife's blood calls to ours across the divide of death. I don't understand. Among our people, when a man marries a woman, he marries her family, her history, her connections to all who came before. Your Margaret carried Cheyenne blood, sister blood to ours. That makes you brother to us already." The chief smiled. "Ayana would not be joining a foreign world. She would be completing a circle that began when your wife's mother fell in love with a white man." The revelation reframed everything. Finn thought he understood about his life, his marriage, and the choice now before him. Margaret's hidden heritage wasn't a betrayal, it was a bridge across worlds that had seemed impossibly far apart. As evening approached and the traditional fires were lit, Finn found himself sitting beside Ayana, Margaret's wedding ring warm in his palm. The sacred medicine pouch at Ayana's belt seemed to glow in the firelight as she spoke of her mother's teachings. Her hopes for the future, her willingness to build a life between two worlds. Margaret wanted this, Finn said suddenly, the understanding hitting him like physical revelation. She wanted me to find love again, to honor her mother's memory by not being afraid. Then we honor them both, Ayana replied, her hand covering his. If you are willing. The obsidian arrowhead and Margaret's ring seemed to pulse with shared warmth against his chest, as if the spirits of both worlds were blessing what was about to unfold. For the first time since Margaret's death, Finn felt truly ready to step into an uncertain future, guided by love rather than fear. The revelation of Margaret's heritage transformed the Arapaho camp from formal delegation to extended family gathering. That evening, as stars emerged in the clear Wyoming sky, Chief Broken Arrow formally accepted Finn's decision to honor the marriage proposal. The celebration that followed felt like coming home to a family he'd never known existed. Ayana sat beside him as the elders shared stories of marriages between peoples, of love that transcended boundaries, of the strength that came from blending traditions. She translated when the stories were told in her native language, her voice soft in the firelight, her hand occasionally touching his arm to emphasize a particularly meaningful passage. My grandmother used to say that the Great Spirit weaves threads between souls before they are born, she explained during one such story. Sometimes those threads stretch across great distances, across different worlds, waiting for the right moment to draw people together. Finn found himself watching her face in the dancing light, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes, the way she listened with her whole being when the elders spoke. This wasn't the uncertain arrangement he'd first imagined. This was a woman choosing her path with clear understanding of its challenges and possibilities. Are you certain about this? He asked quietly. Leaving your people, your home, everything you've known? I'm not leaving my people, she corrected gently. I'm expanding them. And you're not taking me from my home. You're giving me a new one to cherish alongside the old. Over the following days, practical preparations began alongside spiritual ones. Ayana proved remarkably adaptable to ranch life, learning quickly how to work alongside Finn in his daily routines. She had an intuitive understanding of horses that impressed even Jasper, who seemed to respond to her touch with unusual gentleness. Your land is sick, she observed on the third day, as they surveyed the drought-stressed pastures. But not dying. The earth remembers how to be healthy. It just needs help remembering. She showed him techniques her people used for water conservation, ways of reading the landscape that he'd never learned in his years of ranching. Her knowledge complemented his experience in unexpected ways, creating possibilities he'd never considered. But their growing partnership faced challenges from outside the ranch. Word of the Arapaho presence had spread through the territory, and reactions were mixed at best. Harvey Patterson arrived on the fourth day, his face flushed with heat and indignation. He rode hard to the ranch, barely acknowledging the peaceful camp before confronting Finn on his own porch. Have you lost your mind? Patterson demanded. There's talk all over the county about you consorting with savages. Some folks are saying you've gone native, that you're planning to marry one of them. Careful with your words, Harvey, Finn replied calmly. These are good people and they're my guests. Good people? Patterson's voice rose. They're Indians, Finn. This is exactly the kind of weakness that leads to trouble. Give them an inch. They'll take everything you own. Have you met any of them? Talked with them. Don't need to put my hand in a rattlesnake den to know it's dangerous. Patterson gestured toward the camp. Send them packing before this gets out of hand. Before they decide your hospitality means they can help themselves to your cattle, your horses, maybe your scalp. Ayana appeared at the cabin door, having heard the raised voices. She stood quietly, her presence dignified despite Patterson's obvious hostility. Miss, Patterson said, his tone condescending. You speak English? Better than you speak Arapaho, she replied evenly. Patterson's face darkened. See what I mean, Finn? Uppity as you please. This is what comes of treating them like equals. That's enough, Finn said, stepping between Patterson and Ayana. I'll thank you to show respect to my guests, or you can leave my property. Your property? Patterson laughed harshly. From what I hear, you won't have property much longer. Wells is already talking about the foreclosure sale. The words hit like a physical blow, reminding Finn of the financial reality he'd temporarily forgotten in the wonder of recent events. Patterson saw the impact and pressed his advantage. That's right, half the county knows you're broke. Is that what this is about? Think marrying an Indian will solve your money problems? Think her tribe will pay your debts? Get out, Finn said quietly, his voice carrying deadly calm. Get off my land and don't come back. Patterson mounted his horse, his parting shot designed to wound. Mark my words, Riverside, this will end badly. Indians and whites don't mix, never have, never will. When trouble comes, don't expect help from decent folk. After Patterson rode away, Finn stood on his porch, feeling the weight of community disapproval settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. Ayana came to stand beside him, her presence comforting despite the chaos Patterson had introduced. He speaks from fear, she said simply, but fear spreads like fire in dry grass. We must be careful. That evening, Chief Broken Arrow called a council meeting. The mood was more serious than on previous nights, the elders' faces grave in the firelight. Running Bear spoke first, his words translated by Takoda for Finn's benefit. He says there are riders moving through the territory. White men asking questions about our presence here. Some carry guns, some carry anger. The signs are not good. What kind of questions? Finn asked. Whether we are armed for war, whether you have been taken prisoner, whether we plan to raid other ranches. Chief Broken Arrow's voice carried weary familiarity with such suspicions. The same questions we have heard for generations, born from the same fears. Ayana leaned forward, her voice urgent. Father, perhaps we should postpone the ceremony. Wait until tensions cool. No, Finn said firmly. We won't let fear dictate our choices. That's exactly what Margaret warned against in her letter. Chief Broken Arrow nodded approvingly. Fear is the enemy of all good things. But wisdom says we must prepare for trouble while hoping for peace. The next morning brought Harrison Wells to the ranch, riding with two men Finn didn't recognize, hard-looking types who kept their hands near their guns. Wells's usual polished demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled anger. Riverside, he called without dismounting. I came to discuss your situation, but I see you're occupied. My situation hasn't changed, Wells. I still don't have your money. Oh, but it has changed. Word is you're planning to marry into that savage camp. That puts a different light on things entirely. Wells gestured toward his companions. These gentlemen represent certain concerned citizens who feel your association poses a threat to community safety. One of the strangers, a lean man with cold eyes, spoke up. Name's Cutter McGraw. Me and my boys have experience dealing with Indian problems. We're here to make sure this situation doesn't get out of hand. Finn recognized the type. Hired guns who thrived on conflict, men who saw violence as the first solution to any problem. There's no situation here, McGraw. Just peaceful people conducting a ceremony. Ceremony? Wells's voice dripped contempt. You mean a savage wedding? Binding yourself to heathens and their heathen ways? I mean honoring a commitment to people who saved my life through their kindness. And in the process, you'll default on your loan, lose this ranch, and probably get yourself killed when their warriors decide they want more than just one white scalp. Wells pulled out his pocket watch. You have 36 hours to pay what you owe, Riverside. After that, foreclosure proceedings begin immediately. 36 hours? You said 7 days. That was before you chose to consort with savages. The bank can't extend credit to someone whose judgment is clearly compromised. Wells wheeled his horse around. Think carefully about your choices, Riverside. Some mistakes can't be undone. As the three men rode away, Finn felt the walls closing in from all directions. The wedding ceremony was planned for tomorrow evening, timed to coincide with the new moon that held special significance in Arapaho tradition. But now external forces were gathering to prevent it, driven by prejudice and greed in equal measure. That afternoon, artisans in the camp put finishing touches on the hand-carved wedding totem that would symbolize the union of two worlds. The wooden sculpture stood nearly 3 feet tall, intricately carved with symbols representing both Arapaho and white traditions, eagles and horses, mountains and rivers, the sun and moon in eternal dance around each other. Ayana ran her fingers over the smooth wood, tracing patterns that told the story of their coming together. "It's beautiful," she murmured, "but I fear it may never serve its purpose." "It will," Finn said with more confidence than he felt. "Whatever comes, we face it together. That's what marriage means, isn't it? Standing together against whatever the world throws at you." She smiled, but worry shadowed her dark eyes. Around them, the camp prepared for celebration while also quietly preparing for defense. Tomorrow would bring either the beginning of a new life or the violent end of hopes that had dared to cross the boundaries others had built. The wedding totem stood silently in the firelight, waiting to fulfill its destiny or become a monument to dreams that had reached too far across a divided world. The wedding ceremony began at sunrise as tradition demanded. Chief Broken Arrow had applied ceremonial war paint to his face, not for battle, but for spiritual protection, the ancient symbols designed to ward off negative spirits and ensure the blessing of ancestors. The red and white patterns traced the history of his family line, each mark carrying generations of meaning. Ayana stood radiant in the morning light, wearing the doe-skin dress her grandmother had made for her own wedding ceremony 50 years earlier. The intricate beadwork told stories of love conquering adversity, of families joining across tribal boundaries, of the eternal dance between earth and sky. Her hair was braided with silver ornaments that caught the dawn light like captured stars. Finn had chosen his best clothes. The wool suit Margaret had insisted he buy for church, the white shirt she'd pressed with such care, the boots he'd polished until they gleamed. But around his neck, he wore a beaded necklace Ayana had made. For him, traditional Arapaho symbols worked in blue and white that marked him as family to her people. The ceremony itself was beautiful in its simplicity. Chief Broken Arrow spoke the ancient words that had joined couples for countless generations, his voice carrying the weight of tradition across the prairie wind. Ayana's responses came in her native language, musical syllables that seemed to blend with the morning song of birds and the distant sound of water over stones. When Finn spoke his vows, he used the English words Ayana had taught him, promising not just love, but respect for her people, her traditions, her world. The obsidian arrowhead hung warm against his chest, while Margaret's ring, his wife's hidden heritage made manifest, waited in his pocket for the moment when past and future would join in the present. The most sacred part of the ceremony came when Running Bear brought forth the unity cord, a rope woven from fibers of different plants, each chosen for its symbolic meaning. Strength from the buffalo grass, flexibility from willow bark, endurance from pine root. As their hands were bound together with this cord, Finn felt the weight of commitment not just to Ayana, but to a way of life he was only beginning to understand. Two become one, Chief Broken Arrow intoned, but one that is stronger than two alone. That was when they heard the thunder of approaching horses. The sound came from the east, where the trail wound through the rocky outcroppings that marked the edge of Finn's property. At first, it was just a rumble in the distance, but it grew quickly into the unmistakable rhythm of many riders moving fast and hard. The ceremonial gathering turned to look as one, peaceful faces suddenly alert with concern. Finn's heart sank as he recognized the lead rider, Cutter McGraw, the hired gun who had accompanied Wells the day before. Behind him rode perhaps 15 men, all armed, their intentions written clearly in their aggressive approach. "Stay calm," Chief Broken Arrow commanded quietly. Let them speak first. Do nothing to give them excuse for violence. But Finn could see the tension rippling through the Arapaho camp like wind through grass. These were warriors, men who had fought to protect their families and their way of life. The fact that they remained seated, hands away from weapons, spoke to their discipline and respect for their chief's judgment. McGraw and his men thundered to a halt perhaps 30 yards from the ceremony, their horses snorting and stamping, clearly pushed hard to arrive at this moment. McGraw himself was a lean man with cold grey eyes and the kind of moustache favoured by men who wanted to look dangerous. His coat was pushed back to reveal the pearl-handled revolver at his hip. "Riverside," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "This has gone far enough. Time to end this savage nonsense and get back to civilized behavior." Finn stood slowly, the unity cord still binding his hand to Ayana's. "You're interrupting a private ceremony, McGraw. You're not welcome here." "A private ceremony?" McGraw laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "Looks like a war council to me. Armed Indians gathered on white land, probably planning raids on decent folks' property." "Look around," Finn replied calmly. "Do you see weapons? Do you see war paint beyond ceremonial markings? These people came in peace for a wedding." "Wedding?" One of McGraw's companions, a red-faced man with the look of someone who'd spent too much time in saloons, spat into the dust. "White man marrying a squaw? That's against God and nature both." Chief Broken Arrow rose with dignity that made the mounted men look small by comparison. When he spoke, his English was precise and clear, carrying the authority of generations of leadership. "I am Chief Broken Arrow of the Northern Arapaho. We come here in peace to honor a debt of life. This man saved my nephew, asked nothing in return. We offer family bond in gratitude. This is our way, our honor." "Your way?" McGraw's hand drifted toward his gun. "Your way is raiding and killing. We all know what happens when Indians get too comfortable around white settlements." "That's enough," Finn said, stepping forward. The unity cord stretched between him and Ayana, a physical reminder that he was no longer speaking just for himself. "These people are my guests and my family. I'll ask you once more to leave my property." McGraw smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Your property? Word is you don't own this land anymore. Word is the bank's already filed foreclosure papers." He pulled a document from his jacket. "Matter of fact, I've got a court order here that says this property is now under bank protection. That makes us the law here, Riverside." The paper fluttered in the morning breeze like a death sentence, and Finn felt his world shifting beneath his feet once again. The unity cord that bound Finn's hand to Ayana's suddenly felt like more than ceremonial rope. It felt like a lifeline, anchoring him to something larger than himself. As McGraw waved the foreclosure papers, Finn realized that this moment would define not just his future, but the kind of man he chose to be. "That court order doesn't give you the right to disrupt a peaceful ceremony," Finn said, his voice carrying across the tense silence. "And it doesn't give you the right to threaten my guests." McGraw dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with deliberate force. "Your guests? These are armed savages on what's about to become bank property. I'd say that makes them trespassers. The only weapons I see are the ones you and your men brought," Finn replied. Around the ceremonial circle, the Arapaho delegation remained seated, their discipline remarkable in the face of such provocation. Chief Broken Arrow stood and addressed McGraw directly, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated dignity. "We are not your enemies. We came to honor friendship, to celebrate union between peoples. Why do you bring violence to a ceremony of peace?" "Because I know you're kind," McGraw snarled. "Give you an inch of respect, you'll take everything. Better to settle this now before it spreads." "Settle what?" Ayana spoke for the first time, rising gracefully despite the cord that connected her to Finn. "What wrong have we done that needs settling?" McGraw's eyes fixed on her with obvious contempt. "Existing where you don't belong, princess. Trying to corrupt a white man with your heathen ways." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a badly tended fire. Finn felt anger surge through him, but before he could speak, Another voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, McGraw." Harrison Wells rode into view, flanked by 3 men Finn recognized from town: the sheriff, the mayor, and surprisingly Hans Mueller from the general store. Wells looked uncomfortable, as if events had moved beyond what he'd intended. "I hired you to deliver a foreclosure notice," Wells continued, "not to start a war with the local tribes." McGraw turned toward the banker, his frustration evident. "These Indians are the threat here, Wells. Can't you see that?" "What I see," said Sheriff Tom Bradley, a fair-minded man in his 60s, "is a peaceful gathering being threatened by armed men who weren't invited." He looked around the ceremonial circle, taking in the obvious signs of celebration rather than warfare. "Chief Broken Arrow, I apologize for this interruption." The chief nodded gravely. "Sheriff Bradley, you are welcome here. These others bring trouble where none existed." Hans Mueller urged his horse forward, his honest face troubled. "Finn, is it true? Are you really getting married?" "I am," Finn replied simply. "To a woman who understands both her world and mine, who brings wisdom and kindness to everything she touches. And you're happy with this choice?" Finn looked at Ayanna, seeing in her eyes the strength that had brought her so far from home, the courage that had made her willing to build a life with a man she barely knew. "Happier than I've been in 5 years, Mueller nodded slowly, then turned to address McGraw. "Then I don't see how it's any of our business. Man has a right to marry who he chooses, not when it threatens the community," McGraw insisted. "Mark my words, this is how Indian troubles start. One friendly gesture leads to another. Next thing you know, they think they own the place. The only trouble I see is what you brought with you," Sheriff Bradley said firmly. "Chief, how long does your delegation plan to stay in the area?" "We depart tomorrow morning, Sheriff. Our purpose here is nearly complete. And you, Finn, you planning to stay on the ranch?" Finn's heart sank as he remembered the foreclosure papers. "If I can find a way to keep it." Wells cleared his throat uncomfortably. "About that, perhaps we can discuss terms. The bank isn't eager to manage ranch property, especially if there are complications." "What kind of terms?" Finn asked, though he knew he had little to bargain with. "Extended payment schedule. Lower interest, provided, of course, that there are no further incidents that might reflect poorly on the bank's judgment." Finn understood the implied threat. Wells was offering a lifeline, but only if the marriage proceeded quietly, without the kind of publicity that might embarrass the bank or inflame community tensions. Before he could respond, Dakota appeared among the riders, having approached unseen during the confrontation. Behind him rode 6 more Arapaho warriors, not in ceremonial dress, but in practical traveling clothes, their presence adding a new dimension to the standoff. "Uncle!" Dakota called to Chief Broken Arrow. "We heard voices raised in anger. Is there trouble?" McGraw's hand moved toward his gun, but Sheriff Bradley was quicker, his own weapon appearing with practiced ease. "Nobody draws iron here," the sheriff commanded. "This ends now, one way or another." The unity cord seemed to pulse with warmth against Finn's wrist as he realized the moment had come for the choice that would define everything. Around him, 2 worlds balanced on the edge of conflict or understanding, and his words would tip the balance. "The ceremony isn't finished," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "If you'll allow us to complete what we started, then you can all judge for yourselves whether love is something to be feared." The rope that bound him to Ayanna felt like the strongest thing in the world. 6 months later, the ranch that had once struggled with drought and debt showed signs of transformation that bordered on miraculous. The spring rains had been generous, but more than weather had changed the land. Ayanna's knowledge of water conservation and soil restoration had turned brown pastures green again, while her understanding of horse behavior had improved the livestock's health and temperament in ways that amazed neighboring ranchers. Finn stood on the porch of their home, no longer his alone, but truly theirs, watching his wife work with a young colt that had been born just after the wedding. She moved with the patient grace that had first captured his attention, speaking softly in both English and Arapaho as she taught the foal to accept a halter. The morning sun caught the silver ornaments in her hair, the same ones she'd worn on their wedding day. now part of her daily routine rather than ceremonial dress. The confrontation that had nearly destroyed their wedding ceremony had ended not in violence, but in unexpected understanding. When Chief Broken Arrow had invited the gathered crowd to witness the completion of the ceremony, most had stayed. Even McGraw's hired guns had remained, though their hands stayed near their weapons throughout the vows. The moment that changed everything came when Finn had placed Margaret's ring on Ayana's finger. As he spoke the words about honoring both their heritages, about building a bridge between worlds, Sheriff Bradley had stepped forward with an expression of recognition that surprised everyone. "Hold on," the sheriff had said. "Not in interruption, but in dawning understanding. That ring, I've seen work like that before. Native craftsmanship, but old, maybe 60 years or more. My grandmother had one just like it. Said it came from the Cheyenne trading posts," Finn had told the story then. About Margaret's hidden heritage, about the fear that had kept her silent for 27 years, about the letter that had freed him to love without boundaries. The revelation had rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat, changing how people saw not just this marriage, but the very idea of what brought communities together. Hans Müller had been the first to step forward and congratulate them, his honest face shining with approval. "My grandfather married a Sioux woman in Minnesota," he'd said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Best woman he ever knew, raised 7 children and helped build half the town. Blood doesn't make a person good or bad, actions do." The moment had opened floodgates of long-hidden stories. Other settlers spoke of native wives and husbands, of children who carried mixed heritage, of friendships and partnerships that had been kept quiet out of fear of community judgment. It seemed that Finn and Ayana's courage had given others permission to acknowledge their own connections across cultural lines. Even Harrison Wells had found a way to make peace with the situation. The extended payment plan he'd offered included provisions for Ayana's farming innovations and Finn's improved livestock management. The bank, it turned out, was more interested in successful loans than failed foreclosures, especially when success came with the kind of community support that made for stable investment. McGraw and his hired guns had left without further incident, outnumbered not by weapons, but by the simple decency of people who chose understanding over fear. Sheriff Bradley had made it clear that troublemakers weren't welcome in his county, regardless of who hired them, and the threat of outside agitation had faded as quickly as it had appeared. Now, as Finn watched his wife work with the colt, he marveled at how completely his life had transformed. The morning routine that had once been solitary ritual was now shared conversation over coffee that Ayana brewed with wild herbs she'd gathered from the mountain slopes. The evening meals that had been eaten in silence now included stories, laughter, and the gentle sound of Ayana's voice teaching him words in her language while he helped her practice reading English. The changes went far beyond personal happiness. The ranch itself had become something neither of them could have imagined alone. Ayana's water conservation techniques had not only restored the drought-damaged pastures, but had created small, wetland areas that attracted wildlife and provided natural irrigation for their expanded vegetable gardens. Her knowledge of native plants had introduced crops that thrived in the harsh climate while enriching the soil for traditional farming. The new family photograph sat on the mantel beside Margaret's picture, showing Finn and Ayana flanked by Chief Broken Arrow and several tribal elders during their most recent visit. The image captured more than just family. It documented the first formal treaty between the local tribes and the territorial government, an agreement that Finn and Ayana's ranch had helped negotiate by serving as neutral ground for the discussions. Ayana had insisted that Margaret's photograph remain in its place of honor, never suggesting it be moved or replaced. "She brought us together," his wife had said simply during their first week of marriage. "She deserves to see what her love made possible." The two photographs stood side by side now, past and future united in the present they'd helped create. The financial pressure that had once threatened to destroy everything had not only eased, but reversed itself completely. The ranch now operated at a profit for the first time in Finn's memory. Ayana's techniques had increased the carrying capacity of the land by nearly 40%, while her connections to tribal trading networks had opened new markets for their livestock that paid premium prices for animals raised using traditional methods. More importantly, neighboring ranchers had begun making pilgrimages to the ranch, seeking advice on water conservation and pasture management. What had started as curiosity about Indian methods had evolved into genuine respect for indigenous knowledge that had sustained life on these lands for centuries. Finn found himself in the unexpected role of teacher, sharing techniques he'd learned from his wife while she worked directly with the more complex cases. The ranch now hosted regular visits from Ayana's extended family, transforming the isolated homestead into a gathering place where two cultures shared knowledge and stories. These weren't just social calls, they were working partnerships that benefited everyone involved. Tribal artisans taught local craftsmen traditional techniques, while ranchers shared innovations in toolmaking and animal husbandry. Takoda had become almost a permanent fixture, splitting his time between the tribal lands and the ranch, where he'd established a horse training business that served both communities. His expertise with difficult animals had earned him a reputation that stretched across 3 counties, and his presence served as a living bridge between worlds that had too often viewed each other with suspicion. Community acceptance had grown slowly but steadily, built on practical results rather than abstract ideals. The wedding had been the turning point, but trust was earned through daily interactions. Ayana's assistance during Mrs. Patterson's difficult pregnancy, Finn's help when the Henderson barn caught fire, the couple's quiet but consistent participation in town events and church gatherings. Harvey Patterson himself had undergone the most dramatic transformation. The gruff rancher who had once warned Finn about Indian trouble had become one of their strongest supporters after a winter storm trapped his family for 3 days without heat. It was Ayana who had ridden through the blizzard with medicinal herbs when his youngest daughter developed pneumonia, staying with the family for 2 days to nurse the child back to health. "I was wrong," Patterson had told Finn publicly at the next town meeting. "Wrong about a lot of things. Your wife saved my daughter's life, and I won't forget that. Don't care what color her skin is or what language she prays. She's got more Christian charity in her little finger than most folks have in their whole bodies." The comment had carried special weight coming from Patterson, whose opinions influenced many of the newer settlers. After that endorsement, opposition to the mixed marriage had dwindled to a few die-hard holdouts who kept their prejudices to themselves. As evening approached and the work of the day wound down, Finn joined Ayana in the corral where she was finishing with the colt. The young horse nuzzled her hand gently, already trusting despite its brief time in the world. The transformation of animals under her care continued to amaze him, not just in their behavior, but in their obvious contentment and health. "He'll make a good riding horse," she said, scratching behind the colt's ears with the gentle confidence that characterized all her interactions with animals. "Strong legs, gentle temperament, intelligent eyes. He learns quickly and doesn't hold grudges. Like his trainer," Finn replied, slipping his arms around his wife's waist from behind, breathing in the scent of sage and wildflowers that always seemed to cling to her hair. She leaned back against him, comfortable in the embrace that had become as natural as breathing. The physical affection that had developed between them still surprised Finn sometimes, not its presence, but its easy naturalness. With Margaret, love had grown slowly from friendship and shared hardship. With Ayana, attraction and respect had bloomed simultaneously, creating something deeper than either could have achieved alone. "Takoda brings news tomorrow," she said, her voice carrying the contentment that had replaced the uncertainty of their early days together. "My father wants to discuss the fall gathering. He's thinking of holding it here if we're willing." Here, on the ranch, Finn felt a flutter of nervousness mixed with pride. The fall gathering was the most important social and spiritual event of the Arapaho year, bringing together families from across the territory for trading, storytelling, and religious ceremonies, neutral ground he calls it, a place where both worlds meet in peace. She turned in his arms to face him, her dark eyes reflecting the last light of day. It would mean perhaps 200 people camping on our land for a week. Native families, but also white traders, government officials, anyone interested in peaceful commerce. The magnitude of the suggestion struck Finn fully. Such a gathering would establish their ranch as an official meeting place between cultures, a recognition of what they'd accomplished together, but also a responsibility that would shape the rest of their lives. "What do you think?" she asked, though her expression suggested she already knew his answer. Finn looked around at the land they'd restored together, at the life they'd built from nothing more than a stranger's kindness and the courage to love beyond boundaries. In the distance, the mountains caught the last light of day, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded him of the morning they'd first met. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, an owl called its ancient greeting to the night, and from the house came the warm glow of lamplight through windows that no longer framed solitude. "I think Margaret would approve," he said finally, his voice carrying the certainty that had grown with each passing day of their marriage. "I think she'd say we're finally learning what she always knew, that home isn't a place you inherit or defend. It's something you create with the people you choose to love." The obsidian arrowhead and Margaret's ring hung together on a chain around his neck now, twin talismans of the journey that had brought him from loneliness to belonging. They had become more than jewelry. They were reminders of the moments when ordinary kindness had created extraordinary change, when small choices had shaped entire destinies. Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, ancient lights that had witnessed countless stories of love and loss, conflict and reconciliation. Tonight, they shone down on a ranch that had become something unprecedented, a place where different worlds had chosen to become one, where the future was being written by people brave enough to believe that understanding was stronger than fear. As they walked toward the house together, Ayana's hand warm in his, Finn reflected on the strange alchemy that had transformed a desperate cowboy's last act of kindness into a love story that would be told for generations. The water he'd shared with a dying stranger had returned to him multiplied beyond measure, proving that Margaret's faith in the mysterious workings of generosity had been justified all along. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to build bridges or watch them burn. But tonight, as lamplight spilled golden across their threshold and the sounds of home welcomed them in from the prairie darkness, Finn knew he had found something rarer than water in the desert. He had found a love that made both worlds larger, stronger, and infinitely more beautiful than either could ever be alone.